It started like any other job. I needed money, so I took a gig at the local fast food joint. The pay was meager, and the work was mind-numbing, but it paid the bills. Little did I know that my mundane life was about to take a terrifying turn. In the beginning, everything seemed normal. The sizzle of burgers on the grill, the scent of fries wafting through the air. It was all textbook fast food chaos. But there was something off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't until a few weeks into the job that I started noticing peculiarities. It began with odd sounds, whispers echoing in the empty corridors, the faint creaking of the floorboards when no one else was around. I chalked it up to my imagination, the product of late nights and long hours. But then there were the coworkers, my supposed colleagues, who seemed a bit too pale, a bit too distant. I dismissed my suspicions, thinking perhaps they were just overworked like me. Denial was easier than confronting the unthinkable. It wasn't until one particularly slow evening that reality came crashing down around me. A customer approached the counter, complaining that there was no one at the till. A middle-aged man with a weathered face and tired eyes. He looked past me, his gaze fixed on the empty space behind the cash register. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tinged with annoyance. "Aren't you going to take my order?" Confused, I turned around to see my coworker manning the till. I looked around and saw my other coworkers busy in the kitchen. Cold dread settled in my stomach as I realized that the customer couldn't see my coworkers. Somehow, I was the only one who could. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to make sense of what I had witnessed. It was then that I remembered something. The obituaries I had glanced at in the local newspaper, the familiar faces of my co-workers staring back at me from the pages of the dead. A sickening realization dawned on me. My co-workers were ghosts. Somehow, I had been working alongside the deceased, oblivious to their true nature. Panic clawed at my throat as I grappled with the implications of my discovery. Was I in danger? Why were these spirits lingering in the fast food joint? I needed answers, so I began researching the history of the restaurant, digging through old records and newspaper archives. That's when I stumbled upon a chilling tale from years ago, a tragic incident that had claimed the lives of several employees in a gruesome accident right on the premises. The pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. The lingering spirits were the restless souls of those who had met their untimely end. Somehow the tragedy had bound them to the fast food joint, trapping them in a nightmarish limbo. As I read through the accounts, a name caught my eye: Walter Blackwood, the manager of the restaurant at the time of the tragedy. His face stared back at me from a yellowed photograph, his eyes devoid of emotion. I was still interested to know more about Walter Blackwood and what might have happened to him since the newspaper articles didn't hold much information. I'd have to wait until I got home from my shift to do any more digging. The interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering in time with the buzzing of the tired old refrigerators. A pungent smell of grease and something oddly metallic lingered in the air. The place was deserted this evening, except for a lanky figure behind the counter, his eyes barely visible beneath the brim of his cap. I approached him, and he handed me an apron without a word. Later, while on my break, I happened to look at the menu. It, too, was bizarre, offering items I had never heard of: eternal fries, soulful shakes, and otherworldly burgers. I didn't dare ask what was in them. I didn't want to know. I soon discovered that this fast food joint didn't follow the rules of any other restaurant. There were strange regulars who would come in the dead of night, their eyes hollow and faces pale, whispering in hushed tones to the employees. My guess was they were dead too, seeing as anyone with a pulse couldn't see them at all. As the days passed, I observed my ghostly co-workers more closely. They went about their tasks with an eerie efficiency, as if they were trapped in a loop, reliving their final moments over and over again. It was as if they were bound to the restaurant, unable to move on to the afterlife. One evening, I mustered the courage to explore the kitchen, hoping to gain a deeper understanding of the restaurant's operations beyond the limited view provided by the small serving window. My heart raced in my chest as I cautiously pushed the door ajar. The sight that met my eyes sent a chill down my spine. The cooks, if you could call them that, were not human. Their bodies were translucent, allowing me a ghastly view of their internal organs as they moved and worked with an eerie, unsettling transparency. I tried to quit the next day, but something held me back. It was as if the restaurant had seeped into my very soul, binding me to its nightmarish reality. One night, after the last customer had left and the restaurant fell into a deep silence, I mustered the courage to follow my coworkers after their shifts ended. Determined to unravel the mystery that surrounded them, I discreetly trailed behind them, keeping my distance to avoid suspicion. They moved with purpose, their spectral figures gliding gracefully through the darkness. My heart raced as we approached the graveyard adjacent to the restaurant. I hid behind a crumbling mausoleum, watching in disbelief as my coworkers gathered around a tombstone. Whispers filled the air, and an ominous glow enveloped the tombstone they were all stood around. I strained my ears, trying to decipher their hushed conversation. Fragments of words reached me, a cryptic dialogue that hinted at a sinister pact made in the shadows of the afterlife. I watched in horror as Walter's ghostly figure emerged from the tombstone, his eyes piercing through the darkness. I approached the tombstone, careful not to alert them. Engraved upon it was a name I recognized, Walter Blackwood, the founder and manager of the fast food chain. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Walter Blackwood was deceased too, and had somehow returned from the grave, binding my co-workers to his will in a macabre alliance. Walter's eyes locked onto mine. A wicked smile twisted his ethereal features as he revealed himself. I stumbled back, my mind reeling from the revelation. I had unwittingly become a witness to a supernatural phenomenon. Fear gripped me as I realized the perilous position I was in. The restaurant I had been working at stood upon sacred ground, a place of power that bridged the realms of the living and the dead. In exchange for their souls, my co-workers had been granted a semblance of life, forever bound to serve the sinister purpose of Walter Blackwood. My cries reverberated far and wide. I was certain someone had heard them. But then I fell silent, my final thoughts consumed by the fear of becoming like my colleagues, trapped in the endless cycle of fast food work. Take heed, anyone preparing for an interview at McDonald's or Wendy's. Steer clear and avoid the fast food grind at all costs.